The wind in Redemption Gulch had teeth, and it bit with the cold spite of a thing that had never known warmth. It scoured the dust from the single rutted street and piled it against the false fronts of the general store and the saloon, a fine gritty powder that coated everything in a uniform shade of despair. The sky was the color of a faded bruise, vast and empty, pressing down on the splintered planks and hard-packed earth with an indifferent weight. It was a place where hope came to die, and its bleached bones were the foundations of the town. At the edge of this desolation, near the mud-crusted hitching rail of the land office, stood two figures. They were sisters, though one looked old enough to be the other's mother. The elder, May, stood unnaturally still, a statue carved from some resilient foreign wood. Her dress, a dark silk meant for a different world, was frayed at the cuffs and hemmed with the town's ubiquitous dust. It hung on her slender frame, a whisper of a life left behind. Her hands were clasped before her, knuckles white, holding back a tremor that threatened to shake her apart. Beside her, clutching a fold of the silk dress, was the younger sister, Lynn. Her face, small and pale, was buried in the fabric, her thin shoulders shuddering with silent sobs. She was a child, no more than 8, and the cold of the wind seemed to pass right through her thin coat. The town watched. They watched from behind the grimy windows of the saloon, from the doorway of the mercantile, from the shaded boardwalk. Their gazes were a mixture of pity, contempt, and a profound, weary indifference. These were people accustomed to hardship, who saw suffering as a constant, like the wind. The sisters were merely today's spectacle. Their sponsor, the man who had paid their passage from a land of jade and silk to this world of iron and dust, had died 2 days prior, his lungs full of the very rock he had sought to tear from the earth. He had left behind nothing but debts, and the largest of those debts was held by Silas Blackwood. Blackwood stood before them now, a man carved from the same hard granite as the surrounding hills. He was tall and broad, dressed in a tailored wool coat that defied the wind and the dust. His face was clean-shaven, his silver hair neatly combed, but his eyes were chips of obsidian, cold and possessive. He held a sheaf of papers in one gloved hand, tapping it against the other with a rhythmic, impatient beat. "The contract is clear," Blackwood stated, his voice carrying easily over the sighing wind. It was not a loud voice, but it had a quality of command that cut through all other sound. "His assets revert to me to settle his accounts. And you," he gestured with the papers at May, "are an asset." May did not flinch. She raised her head, and for the first time her eyes met his. They were dark, deep-set, and held a quiet fire that Blackwood seemed to find irritating. "We are not property, sir," she said. Her English was careful, accented, each word placed with deliberation. A low chuckle rumbled in Blackwood's chest. "In this place, girl, you are whatever the law says you are. The contract covers your labor for a period of 5 years. It is now my contract." He looked down at the shivering child. "I have a place for you at the hotel in the next county. Cooking, cleaning, good, honest work." He then pointed a gloved finger at Lynn. "The child, however, there is a mission school 200 miles east. They will take her." The quiet fire in May's eyes blazed. The hand clutching her sister tightened. "No," she said, the single word as sharp and unyielding as a shard of glass. "We will not be separated." "It is not your decision to make," Blackwood said, his patience wearing thin. The polished veneer was cracking, revealing the cruelty beneath. He took a step forward. The sheriff will see you onto the morning stage, both of you, to your respective destinations." He turned to the town's lawman, a man with a stained mustache and the weary eyes of someone long accustomed to compromise. Sheriff Miller shifted his weight, avoiding May's gaze. He was a tool of Blackwood's will, and everyone knew it. May's composure finally broke. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She knelt, pulling her sister into a fierce embrace, whispering to her in their native tongue, a stream of soft, desperate sounds that were as alien to this place as the silk of her dress. The crowd shifted, some looking away, a few murmuring. The cruelty was too plain, too stark, even for Redemption Gulch. But no one moved to intervene. Thane watched from the far end of the street, his horse tethered outside the mercantile. He had been standing there for 10 minutes, a tall, lean silhouette against the pale light, still as a weathered fence post. He came to town only 4 times a year for salt, flour, coffee, and cartridges. He preferred the silence of his high country ranch, a silence broken only by wind in the pines. The noise and smell of the town were a violation, a necessary evil he endured with stoic patience. He had seen the sisters arrive weeks ago, shadows flitting behind the ailing prospector. He had noted their quiet dignity, the way the older one cared for the younger, a fierce, protective aura around them that seemed to push back against the harshness of the world. He had also seen Blackwood watching them, his obsidian eyes lingering with an ownership that had nothing to do with contracts. Thane's world had been hollowed out 5 years ago. Fever, swift and merciless, had taken his wife, Sarah, and their infant son, leaving behind a silence in his cabin that was louder than any scream. He had retreated into that silence, into the hard, repetitive labor of survival, building a wall of solitude around his grief. He did not interfere in the affairs of others. The world could burn for all he cared. His had already turned to ash, but as he watched May kneel in the dust, her body a shield for her sister, something shifted inside him. It was a faint, rusty creak, like a hinge that had not been used in years. He saw not a stranger, but a woman, protecting her family. He saw in Blackwood's cold eyes the same indifferent cruelty as the fever that had stolen everything from him. It was a force that took, without reason, that broke things for the sake of breaking them. For the first time in 5 years, Thane felt the stirrings of a cold, quiet rage. He untied his horse's reins from the post, his movements economical and deliberate. He did not stride, he simply moved, his worn leather boots making little sound in the thick dust. The crowd parted for him without a word, sensing a change in the tension that held the street in its grip. He was a known man, but not a familiar one. Thane of the High Ridge, a man who kept to himself. He stopped a few feet from Blackwood, his horse's reins still looped in one hand. He did not look at the powerful man. His gaze was on May, who had looked up at his approach, her face a mask of tear-streaked dust and wary desperation. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, another man come to pass judgment. Thane finally turned his head, his pale blue eyes meeting Blackwood's. They were eyes accustomed to long distances, to seeing the subtle shift of a deer in the timberline or the first sign of a storm on the horizon. They saw Blackwood for exactly what he was. "What's the debt?" Thane's voice was rough, like stones grinding together, a voice unused to conversation. Blackwood's eyebrow arched in surprise, then amusement. "This is not your concern, rancher. I'm making it my concern, Thane said. The words were flat without inflection, but they held an immovable weight. His contract was for labor. He's no longer here to labor for. What's the cash value? A speculative gleam entered Blackwood's eyes. He saw, not a savior, a lonely man with a soft spot. The remainder of the contract, the cost of passage, interest, it's a considerable sum. More than a man like you can afford. He named a figure that was deliberately, absurdly high. A price that would cripple a small ranch. For years, the crowd murmured. It was extortion, plain and simple. Thane didn't blink. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a worn leather pouch. It was heavy. It held the savings of 5 solitary years. The money he had no one to spend it on, the coin that had lost all meaning when his family died. He had been on his way to the bank to deposit it, a meaningless ritual. Now it had a purpose. He tossed the pouch to Sheriff Miller, who caught it out of reflex. "Count it," Thane commanded. The sheriff, flustered, opened the pouch and poured a stream of gold and silver coins onto the lid of a nearby barrel. He began to count, his lips moving silently. Blackwood watched his smug expression slowly hardening into one of disbelief and then fury as the pile grew. The final count was announced in a low, astonished voice. It was not only enough, it was more than Blackwood had asked. "The debt is paid," Thane said, his gaze still locked on Blackwood. "The contract is mine, and I'm voiding it." He looked at May, who was staring at him, her dark eyes wide with incomprehension. "I need a housekeeper," he said, the words feeling clumsy and false in his own mouth. He gestured vaguely toward the mountains that loomed behind the town. "My cabin, you and the girl. There's food, a roof." It was not a proposal. It was a statement of fact, a solution to a problem. He was not offering charity, he was offering a transaction, something this town and perhaps this woman could understand. May searched his face, her gaze moving over the weathered lines, the quiet set of his jaw, the profound solitude in his pale eyes. She saw no pity there, no lust, none of the things she had come to expect from men in this country. She saw something else, something she could not name, but it felt like solid ground after a long time at sea. She looked at her sister, then back at Thane. Slowly she gave a single formal nod. Blackwood took a step forward, his face contorted with rage. "This is not over," he snarled. Thane ignored him. He turned to May and Lynn. "Get your things," he said, his voice softer than before. "We have nothing," May whispered, her voice barely audible. Thane nodded as if he had expected this. He walked to his horse and untied a canvas roll from behind his saddle. It was his own spare blanket. He handed it to her. "For the child," he said. He then walked into the mercantile, the crowd parting for him once more. He returned minutes later with a sack that he loaded onto his pack mule. It was filled with supplies he hadn't intended to buy. A small pair of boots, 2 wool shawls, a sack of rice, and a tin of sweet biscuits. He paid for them with the last of his pocket money. He helped May onto the pack mule, which was steadier than his horse, and then lifted the small silent child and placed her in front of her sister. He wrapped the blanket around them both. He mounted his own horse without a word. As they rode out of Redemption Gulch, leaving Silas Blackwood standing in the street like a thundercloud, the whispers of the town followed them. But for the first time in a long time, May did not feel their sting. She felt only the solid warmth of her sister in her arms. the rough wool of the blanket against her skin, and the steady, silent presence of the man leading them away from the dust and into the clean, cold air of the mountains. The trail to Thane's homestead was less a road and more a suggestion. It wound upward, through stands of skeletal aspen and thick forests of pine that smelled of resin and damp earth. The air grew thinner, cleaner. The world of Redemption Gulch, with its noise and its cruelty, fell away below them, until it was just a smudge in the vast, indifferent landscape. Thane did not speak. He rode ahead, a steady, capable guide, his back a bulwark against the world they were leaving behind. May held Lynn close, murmuring reassurances in their own language. The child had finally stopped crying, her small body exhausted by fear and cold. She was asleep now, her head resting against May's chest, her breathing a faint, rhythmic puff of white in the frigid air. For May, the silence of the journey was a balm. It was a silence of stone and wood and sky, not the hostile, judgmental silence of the town. She watched the man ahead, studying the set of his shoulders, the easy way he sat his horse. He had bought them in a way just as Blackwood had intended to. But his purchase felt different. It felt like a rescue. The price he had paid was a wall between them and the man with obsidian eyes. For now, that was enough. They arrived as the sun was beginning to bleed its last colors across the western peaks. The homestead was nestled in a small, high meadow, protected on three sides by a dense wall of lodgepole pine. A simple cabin of squared logs, a small barn, and a split-rail corral were the only marks of man in the vast wilderness. Smoke curled from the cabin's stone chimney, a thin, gray ribbon against the deepening violet of the sky. The place was utterly isolated, a world unto itself. It was Spartan, functional, deeply, profoundly lonely. Thane dismounted and came to help them down. His hands were large and calloused as he lifted Lynn, his touch surprisingly gentle. He carried the sleeping child into the cabin without a word. May followed, her legs stiff from the long ride. The inside of the cabin was a single room, dominated by a large stone fireplace where a low fire crackled. It was meticulously clean but stark. A rough-hewn table and two chairs stood in the center. A narrow bed was built into one wall, its single blanket neatly folded. A shelf held a few tin plates, a handful of books, and a half-empty bottle of whiskey. There were no curtains on the two small windows, no rug on the scrubbed plank floor, no pictures on the walls. It was the home of a man who did not live, but merely existed. A place stripped of all comfort, all memory, all softness. It was the architectural equivalent of the man himself. Thane laid Lynn on his own bed and covered her with the blanket. He then turned to the fire, adding more wood until it blazed, pushing back the encroaching chill of the mountain night. He gestured toward the fire, then to the table. "Sit," he said. He moved about the small space with an economy of motion, preparing a simple meal of fried salt pork and coffee. He placed a plate in front of May along with a tin cup of the steaming bitter liquid. He ate, standing his back to the fireplace, watching the night close in through the window. The silence was thick, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of the sleeping child. May ate slowly, forcing the food down. It was the first real meal she had eaten in 2 days. The warmth spread through her, a fragile defense against the cold that seemed to have settled deep in her bones. When she was finished, she stood and took her plate to the wash basin. She looked around, found the soap and a rag, and washed it along with his. It was a small act, But it was a beginning. It was her first step in turning this shelter into a home. The next morning a new rhythm began. Thane rose before dawn, his movements quiet so as not to wake them. He left a pile of fresh firewood inside the door and a pail of fresh milk on the table before heading out to tend to his cattle. When Mia woke, she found him gone. She looked at Lynn, still sleeping soundly, her face less pale in the soft morning light. A feeling of profound, precarious safety settled over her. She did not rest. She began to work with a quiet, determined efficiency. She found a broom and swept the floor until the planks shone. She scrubbed the tabletop. She discovered a small store of potatoes and onions in a root cellar beneath a trapdoor, and began to prepare a stew, the savory aroma slowly filling the cabin, chasing away the lingering scent of solitude and stale wood smoke. She found Thane's mending kit, a simple affair of thick needles and coarse thread, and began to repair the small tears in Lynn's coat. When Thane returned at midday, he stopped in the doorway, momentarily taken aback. The air was warm and smelled of cooking food. A pot simmered over the fire. His spare blanket had been neatly folded at the foot of the bed, where Lynn now sat, awake and watching him with wide, curious eyes. Maya was at the table, humming a soft, unfamiliar tune as she stitched. The cabin felt different. It felt occupied, alive. He said nothing. He washed his hands at the basin and sat at the table. May served him a bowl of the stew. It was rich and flavorful, seasoned with wild herbs she must have found near the cabin. It was the best meal he had eaten in 5 years. They ate in their now customary silence. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the small sounds of life, the clink of a spoon against a bowl, the soft whisper of thread through fabric, the steady breathing of 3 people sharing a small warm space. Days turned into a week, then 2. A silent routine cemented itself. Thane would handle the world outside the cabin walls, the animals, the wood, the hunting. May and Lynn would handle the world within. The transformation of the cabin continued. May found old flour sacks and stitched them into curtains for the windows. She used clay from a nearby creek bed to chink the logs, sealing out the ever-present drafts. She organized his meager supplies with an artist's precision. Lynn, her initial fear fading, began to help, her small hands learning to knead dough for bread or to card the wool from a sheepskin May had found stored in the barn. Communication remained sparse, a language of gestures and single words. He would leave a freshly dressed rabbit on the doorstep. She would leave a plate of hot food on the table for his return. He bought her a small notebook and a pencil on his next trip to the far-off trading post, and she began to write down the English words for things, pointing and waiting for him to supply the sound. Fire, water, bread. He, in turn, learned the name she called her sister, the soft syllables of a lullaby she sang at night. One evening, he came in from the cold to find she had taken one of his discarded shirts and, with meticulous skill, cut it down and sewn it into a new dress for Lynn. The child was twirling in front of the fire, her face alight with a simple, pure joy that had been absent for so long. Thane stood in the doorway and watched, a strange ache in his chest. The cabin, his fortress of grief, was being infiltrated by warmth, by life, and he found he did not have the strength or the will to stop it. It was a man thawing from the inside out, a slow and painful process he did not understand. He felt a flicker of something he had long thought dead, a fragile, terrifying tendril of hope. The first sign of the blizzard was a change in the light. The sharp, crystalline clarity of the high country air softened, turning a milky, ominous white. The wind, usually a steady sigh through the pines, began to moan, a low, predatory sound that vibrated in the logs of the cabin. Thane came in from the barn, his face grim, stomping snow from his boots. "It's here," he said, the words clipped. "A bad one." May looked up from the bread she was kneading. She had seen snow before, but nothing like the fury that was beginning to lash against the small window panes. Within an hour, the world outside had vanished, erased by a swirling vertical torrent of white. The wind screamed like a banshee, tearing at the roof, rattling the door in its frame. The cabin, which had felt like a solid refuge, now seemed like a fragile ship tossed on a raging, frozen sea. Thane worked methodically, securing the cabin against the storm's assault. He banked the fire high, stacked firewood to the ceiling, and checked the seals on the windows and door. He brought in buckets of snow to melt for water. May and Lynn watched him, their faces pale in the flickering firelight. The sheer violence of the storm was terrifying, a raw and untamable power that made their small existence feel impossibly precarious. For 3 days they were prisoners in the small room. The world was reduced to the 4 log walls, the roaring of the wind and the steady hiss of the snow against the chimney. They lived by the light of the fire, their shadows dancing large and distorted on the walls. The enforced proximity changed their dynamic. The silence was no longer comfortable. It was heavy, filled with the unspoken anxieties of their situation. On the 3rd night, Lynn began to cough. First it was a small, dry sound, but by morning it had deepened into a ragged, painful bark that shook her small frame. A feverish flush appeared on her cheeks, and her eyes, usually so bright and curious. May pressed a hand to her forehead, her own face tightening with a familiar, gut-wrenching fear. The child's skin was burning. Thane saw the look on May's face and his blood ran cold. He knew this fever. He knew the sound of that cough. It was the same cough that had stolen his son, the same fever that had consumed Sarah. He felt a wave of panic so intense it threatened to buckle his knees. The storm was a physical manifestation of the memory, trapping him in the same room with the same ghost. He pushed the feeling down, burying it under a lifetime of stoicism. This was not then. He was not the same helpless man. He moved to the bed, his face a mask of grim resolve. "Keep her warm," he ordered, his voice harsh with suppressed emotion. "And keep fluids in her. Snow melt, broth, anything." Thus began the vigil. They worked together as a seamless team, unit forged in the crucible of crisis. Thane kept the fire roaring, melting snow, his large, steady hands surprisingly adept at coaxing a few sips of warm broth between Lynn's cracked lips. Mai sat by the bed, never leaving her sister's side, bathing her face with cool cloths, murmuring to her in their language, a constant, soothing presence against the terrifying storm within and without. The hours blurred into a long, nightmarish stretch of time. Lynn's breathing grew shallow, punctuated by rattling gasps for air. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her small whimpers cutting through the howl of the wind. Thane and May moved around each other in the cramped space, their exhaustion a shared burden. The last of the emotional walls between them crumbled, burned away by the heat of the fever and the intensity. They were no longer a man and his housekeepers. They were 2 people fighting a desperate battle for a child's life. Late on the 4th night, the fever reached its peak. Lynn's body was rigid, her breathing a faint, terrifying whisper. May was weeping silently, her face buried in the blankets, her hope finally extinguished. She was convinced they were losing her. Thane placed a hand on her shoulder. It was the first time he had touched her voluntarily. The contact was electric, a jolt of shared humanity in the desolate room. "Don't," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Not yet." He went to his small shelf and took down the whiskey bottle. He poured a little onto a rag and began to rub it on Lynn's chest and back, the sharp alcoholic smell filling the air. He remembered the town doctor telling him it was a fool's remedy, but he had to do something. He had to fight. As he worked, his focus absolute, May began to speak. Her voice choked with tears, her English broken but clear enough. "In my village," she whispered, staring into the fire, "there was a flood. It took our home. It took my parents." She described their journey, the crowded ship, the promises of a new life that had turned to dust. She spoke of the debt, the endless work, the constant fear, and her fierce, all-consuming need to protect her little sister, the only piece of her old life she had left. "She is all," May whispered, her voice breaking. "She is my only family." Thane listened, his hands never ceasing their work. The story settled into the quiet spaces of his own grief. When she fell silent, the only sounds the wind and Lynn's tortured breathing, he found himself speaking, the words coming out as if from a great distance, dredged up from a place he kept locked away. "I had a son," he said, his voice so quiet May had to lean forward to hear. Of her laughter that used to fill this empty cabin, of the small wooden bird he had carved for his son. A toy the infant had never been strong enough to hold. He described the fever, the same rattling cough, the same helpless vigil in this very room. "I buried them both on the ridge, just as the first snow fell. 5 years ago," he stopped, the confession leaving him hollowed out. He had never spoken of it to anyone. He had carried the weight of it alone, a silent, crushing burden. To speak it aloud now to this woman felt like both a betrayal and a release. May looked at him, her own tears forgotten. She saw the raw, unhealed wound beneath his stoic exterior. She saw the ghost that haunted this cabin, the source of its profound silence. Her heart ached with a sorrow that was both for him and for herself. In their shared landscape of loss, they found a strange and profound connection. They sat in silence for a long time, the storm beginning to abate outside, its fury spent. As the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, Thane reached over and touched Lynn's forehead. He paused, then touched it again. "May," he said, his voice urgent. He motioned for her to feel. She placed her trembling hand on her sister's brow. The fire was gone, her skin was cool, damp with sweat. The fever had broken. Lynn's breathing was deeper now, more regular. She was sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. A wave of relief so powerful it was dizzying washed over May. She looked at Thane, her eyes shining with unshed tears of gratitude. He met her gaze, and in that shared look, something unspoken and irrevocable passed between them. They had faced the ghosts in this cabin together, and they had won. The storm was over, inside and out. The world that emerged after the blizzard. The sun shone with a dazzling, painful brilliance on the untouched snow. For a week they were cut off, living on an island of solid ground in a sea of white. It was a peaceful, almost idyllic time. Lynn recovered quickly, her childish laughter returning to the cabin, a sound that seemed to melt the last of the frost from its corners. Thane taught her how to track rabbits in the snow. Mai taught him how to make dumplings, her hands moving with a fluid grace that fascinated him. They were a family in all but name. But the thaw, when it came, was swift and inevitable. The snow melted, the trail to town became passable again, and the world rushed back in. It arrived in the form of 3 riders, dark figures against the late afternoon sun. Thane saw them from the corral. He recognized the broad, imposing figure of Silas Blackwood, the slumped posture of Sheriff Miller, and the brutish frame of one of Blackwood's hired men. He walked toward the cabin, his hand resting almost unconsciously on the handle of the axe he'd been using to split wood. May had seen them too. She stood in the doorway, her face pale, with Lynn hiding behind her skirts. The brief peace of their mountain sanctuary was shattered. Blackwood dismounted, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He had waited, letting the winter do its work, imagining them starving or frozen. The sight of the cozy smoke-breathing cabin and the 3 of them standing together like a family seemed to fuel his rage. "Thane," he said, his tone deceptively pleasant. "I've come to collect my property." "They're not property," Thane said, his voice a low growl. He stepped in front of May and Lynn, positioning himself between them and the riders. "I pay the debt. You have no claim." Blackwood laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He produced a folded legal document from his coat. "A misunderstanding. I'm afraid my lawyer has reviewed the contract. It specifies personal servitude. It is non-transferable." He held the paper out for the sheriff to see. "The payment you made is considered a penalty for interference, but the contract itself remains under my authority. It's all here, signed and sealed." Thane knew the document was a fraud, a piece of paper given the weight of law by a corrupt sheriff and a powerful man. In this territory, Blackwood's will was the law. "The women come with me," Blackwood stated, his eyes lingering on May with a possessive gleam that made Thane's hands clench into fists. "I have work for them, both of them." Sheriff Miller cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his saddle. "Thane, it's the law. If you resist, I'll have to arrest you. Trespass, obstruction." Blackwood's got a list of charges a mile long he's willing to file. "You'll lose your land." It was the ultimatum. Surrender them or lose everything. Blackwood had planned it perfectly. He knew the land was the only thing Thane had left, or so he thought. Thane looked past them at the cabin. He saw the curtains May had sewn. He could smell the faint scent of the stew she had simmering on the fire. He heard Lynn's frightened whimper. This was no longer just a shelter, just a piece of land. It was a home. They were his home. The choice was not a choice at all. He turned his gaze back to Blackwood, and the cold, quiet rage he had felt in town returned, now honed to a razor's edge. "No," he said. The word was absolute. A stone dropped into a deep well. Blackwood's smile vanished. His face darkened with fury. He had expected compliance, a grudging surrender. This quiet defiance was an insult he could not tolerate. "You fool," he hissed. "You'd throw away everything for a pair of foreign whores." Before Thane could react to the slur, May stepped out from behind him. Her voice, though trembling slightly, was clear and strong. "We are not whores, sir. We are his family." The declaration hung in the cold air. It was a simple statement of fact, but it changed everything. It was a line drawn in the snow, a claim made. Thane looked at her, a surge of fierce pride and protectiveness washing over him. She had stood with him. She had named what he had only just begun to feel. Blackwood's face contorted in a mask of pure malice. His polished control snapped. He was a man who was used to getting his way, who saw people as pawns to be moved and discarded. This unified resistance, this creation of a family where he had intended to sow ruin, was an intolerable affront. "Family?" he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "I'll show you what happens to families that defy me." He turned to his hired man. "Burn the cabin to the ground. We'll see how they feel when they have no home to protect." The hired man, a lout with a vacant expression, dismounted. He pulled a flask of oil from his saddlebag and began to splash it against the dry logs of the cabin wall. The sheriff made a weak protest. "Now, Silas, there's no need for—" But Blackwood cut him off with a murderous glare. Thane started to move, but Blackwood drew a pistol, its black metal gleaming in the fading light. "Stay where you are, rancher. One move and I'll put a bullet in you." The hired man struck a match. The flame touched the oil-soaked logs, and they erupted in a whoosh of orange fire. The dry wood caught instantly, flames licking up the side of the cabin with a hungry, crackling roar. Smoke began to pour from the open doorway. It was then that May screamed a sound of pure terror. "Lynn!" she cried, lunging forward before Thane could stop her. "Lynn is inside!" In the confusion of the confrontation, the child, terrified, had slipped back into the cabin, her place of safety. Now, that sanctuary had become a trap. May ran toward the burning doorway, but the heat and smoke drove her back, her face streaked with soot and tears. She turned, her eyes wild with panic, and saw Blackwood, his face illuminated by the fire, a look of grim satisfaction on his features. She fell to her knees in the snow. "Don't shoot, sir," he pleaded, her voice breaking with desperation as she saw him keep the gun trained on Thane. "My sister is still inside." Her words, her plea to a man without mercy, broke something in Thane. The cold, controlled rage erupted into a white-hot, cleansing fury. The past, the present, his grief, his fear, all of it coalesced into a single, clarifying point of action. He was no longer the man who had stood by and watched his family die. Not again. Never again. He moved. It was not a calculated action, but a pure, primal instinct. He dove sideways, grabbing the heavy chopping axe from the woodpile. He came up in a fluid motion, ignoring the pistol, and hurled the axe not at Blackwood but at the hired man, who was fanning the flames. The heavy blade spun end over end. He screamed and collapsed. In that split second of distraction, Thane charged. He slammed into Blackwood with the force of a battering ram, driving him back. The pistol discharged, the bullet tearing harmlessly into the sky. They crashed to the ground, a tangle of limbs and fury. Thane was leaner, but he was powered by a desperation that Blackwood, a man accustomed to having others fight his battles, could not match. He drove his fist into Blackwood's face once, twice, a third time, the blows landing with solid, satisfying cracks. The sheriff, galvanized into action by the sheer violence of the scene, finally drew his own weapon. "That's enough, Thane." "Stop." But Thane didn't tear him. He had one focus, the fire. He scrambled to his feet, leaving Blackwood groaning in the snow, and ran to the cabin. Thick, black smoke was now billowing from the door and windows. He could hear Lynn coughing inside. Without hesitation, he plunged into the smoke-filled interior. The The heat was a physical blow, searing his lungs. He dropped to the floor where the air was clearer and crawled, shouting Lynn's name. He found her huddled under the table, sobbing with terror. He scooped her into his arms, wrapping his coat around her face, and turned to go back. A burning beam crashed down from the ceiling, blocking the doorway. They were trapped. He looked around wildly, his eyes streaming. The back window, it was small, but maybe. He smashed it with his elbow and shoved Lynn through the opening. As he was about to climb out himself, a section of the roof gave way, raining sparks and burning timber down upon him. Outside, May watched in horror. She saw Lynn pushed to safety, then saw the roof collapse. She screamed his name. She started toward the window, ready to climb into the inferno herself, when a strong hand grabbed her arm. It was the sheriff, his face grim. "It's too late, miss. He's gone." But he was wrong. A moment later, a figure staggered out of the burning doorway, silhouetted against the flames like a demon from hell. It was Thane. His hair was singed, his coat was smoldering, and a long bloody gash was laid open on his arm from a falling timber, but he was alive. He was standing. He walked past them, picked up the axe from where it had fallen, and stood over the whimpering form of Silas Blackwood. His face was a terrible thing to see, streaked with soot, illuminated by the fire of his burning home, his pale eyes glowing with a cold, absolute light. He raised the axe. "No," May cried, running to him, grabbing his free arm. "He is not worth it. We are safe. You saved us. That is all that matters." Thane looked from Blackwood's terrified face to hers. He saw the tears on her cheeks, the fierce, protective love in her eyes. He saw Lynn, safe, being held by the now ashamed sheriff. He saw the life they had built together, and the life that was still possible. The fire in his eyes slowly receded, replaced by a profound, weary clarity. He let the axe fall to his side. The aftermath was a scene of quiet devastation. The cabin was a smoldering ruin, a black skeletal frame against the snow and the twilight. Sheriff Miller's authority finally reasserted, had arrested a battered and broken Silas Blackwood and his injured man. He had promised to see that a wire was sent to the territorial judge, that Blackwood's corruption would finally be brought to light. Justice, it seemed, had finally found its way to Redemption Gulch. But for Thane, May, and Lynn, the victory was a bitter one. They stood together, wrapped in blankets the sheriff had given them, and watched the last of the flames die down. They had nothing left but each other. They spent the night in the barn, huddled together for warmth in the hayloft. Dane's arm had been bandaged by May, her touch gentle and sure. No one slept. They listened to the sounds of the night, the wind whispering through the charred bones of their home. In the depths of that long, cold night, as Lynn slept between them, May reached out in the darkness and found his hand. She laced her fingers through his, a silent gesture of solidarity, of comfort, of shared existence. He held on, his grip firm and steady. They were an anchor for each other in the darkness. The next morning, they began to work. They did not speak of leaving. There was no question of it. This was their land, their home. They had fought for it, and they would rebuild it. Thane began clearing the debris, his movements slow and pained but resolute. May salvaged what she could, a few fire-blackened pots, a handful of tin plates that had survived. Lynn, seeing their determination, began to help, carrying small, unburned pieces of wood and stacking them into a neat pile. Over the next weeks, a new cabin began to rise from the ashes of the old. It was hard, grueling work. Thane felled trees, hewing the logs with a skill born of long practice. Mai learned to mix daubing from mud and grass, her small hands becoming chapped and strong. They worked from sunup to sundown, a silent, efficient team. The town, hearing the story from the sheriff, sent help. The mercantile owner arrived one day with a wagon full of supplies, food, blankets, new tools, and a half-dozen men who offered a day's labor, a quiet apology for their town's previous indifference. The new cabin was larger than the first, with a second small room built on for the sisters. As they raised the final roof beam, Thane stood back and looked at their creation. It was more than a shelter, it was a testament. Every log was a mark of their shared will, every nail a symbol of their refusal to be broken. That evening, as the sun set, casting long golden rays across the meadow, Thane found May by the new unlit hearth. She was running her hand over the smooth river stones he had set in place. He stood beside her, not speaking for a long moment. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. It was a bird, intricately carved from a piece of pale pine, its wings half spread as if about to take flight. He had spent the late hours of the past few nights carving it by lantern light in the barn. It was the first thing he had carved since his son had died. He held it out to her. She took it, her fingers tracing the delicate lines. It was beautiful. "This is your home, May," he said, his voice quiet but steady, free of the rasp of disuse. "Our home." She looked up at him, her dark eyes shining in the dim light. She saw no ghosts in his face, no shadows of the past. She saw only a man, strong and gentle, who had walked through fire for her and her sister. She saw her future. She did not need to say yes. It was already a fact. She simply reached up her hand cool against his rough smoke-stained cheek and leaned in. He met her halfway, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was not about passion, but about peace. It was a promise, a foundation, the final, unshakable timber set in place. Outside, Lynn was chasing fireflies in the twilight, her laughter echoing in the clean mountain air. Thane and May stood in the doorway of the house they had built together, hand in hand, and watched her. The wind whispered through the pines, but it no longer sounded lonely. It sounded like a song. They were a family, forged in fire, and they were finally, truly home.